Welcome to our Tuesday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to teach on how to find, follow, and fulfill God's will. I've been on this teaching for a long time. This is my fourth week, and I'm just now into the middle of this teaching. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit, but I first of all talked about how to find God's will, and that's essential. And then for nearly 2 weeks, this is into my second week of teaching, I'm talking about how to follow God's will. And I've made these points that knowing God's will for your life is essential, but that's not all there is. You also have to learn how to follow God, how to do it God's way. There is a timing to the things that God has for you. None of us step directly into the perfect fulfillment of God's will all at one time. There's steps and stages in growth. And so there's a number of things that we have to learn in order to follow God. And this is where a lot of people miss it. I think that the vast majority of people don't really know what God's will for their life is, but then some who know God's will for their life try and do it in their own strength and power. And let me use ministers as an example. I heard this statistic, and again, I don't know exactly how they come up with all of this, but I heard a statistic that 80% of people who enter the ministry quit within 5 years. That's quite an indictment. Now, there could be multiple reasons for that. I think some of them probably weren't called to the ministry and it just wasn't working and they get out. But I do believe that some people who are called quit because there are a lot of difficulties that go with starting a ministry and doing the things that go with that. And then the statistic goes on to say that out of those 20% who are still in the ministry after 5 years, 80% of those are facing burnout. They're ready to quit and they're just on the verge of quitting. So if you add all of this up, that means that there's only 4% of ministers who are successfully ministering after 5 years. That's a huge statistic. And out of the people that I know who are facing burnout and stuff like this, it's because they're doing it in their own flesh. They are trying to serve God, and they may be like trying to pastor a church or to have a ministry like what I do or something, but they are doing it in their own strength and power. And I tell you, that is a recipe for burnout. God calls us to do things that are bigger than ourselves. And you've got to get beyond yourself in order to really fulfill and follow through on the things that God has for you. So I was using Moses as an example of this, and I've been teaching on this for over a week. So again, if you've missed any of this, please get these materials. I believe that they would really minister to you. But in Exodus chapter 4 is where the Lord appeared unto Moses in the burning bush. That actually took place in chapter 3, but it's continued into chapter 4. And the Lord told Moses 5 different times to go down to Egypt, bring the children of Israel out of bondage. And 5 different times he said, God, I can't do it. And finally, the Lord said, what's that in your hand? And he said, well, it's a stick, it's a rod. And he said, throw it on the ground. And when he threw it on the ground, it turned into a snake. Moses fled from before it. And then the Lord told him in Exodus chapter 4, verse 4, to reach out your hand and take it by the tail. When you take a snake by the tail, that means that you aren't in control. That snake can turn and strike and bite you, and you could die as a result. For Moses to pick this snake up by the tail was him willing to lay down his life and possibly die if that's what God told him to do. And I think that there's much more significance to it than what most people read when they read this. This was the culmination of 40 years of Moses learning that, God, I blew it. I knew what your will for my life was, but I tried to accomplish it in my own strength and power. I've spent 40 years out here in the wilderness. The children of Israel are now 30 years overdue on deliverance from Egypt, according to the prophecy of Genesis chapter 15. And he was just saying, God, I'm wrong. I'll do it your way next time. I'll do anything. You give me another chance. I'll do whatever. So here's the Lord saying, all right, pick up this serpent by the tail. And to Moses' credit, he was willing to obey God even if it meant potential death. And when he grabbed the snake by the tail, it turned back into a rod. But it goes on to say in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 20 that Moses returned and headed down to Egypt, and it says he took the rod of God in his hands. Prior to that, it was Moses' rod. Now it's the rod of God. And I was making comparisons here that you have to literally lay your life down before God. When you do that, it looks like it's going to be the death of all of your visions and stuff. Just like when Moses threw that stick down and took it up by the tail, it looked like it was going to be the death of him. But instead, that's where he got the rod of God. His rod turned into God's rod. And now that rod had supernatural power. He could hold it out over the land and lice would come up. He could touch the waters and they'd turn to blood. He used it to part the Red Sea. He struck a rock and water came out and fed millions of Jews and all of their animals. It now had supernatural power because he had quit doing it his way. He had turned his life over completely to God. It took Moses 40 years to reach that place. And you know what? It takes all of us a while to get to a place to where we say, God, not my will, but yours be done. Whatever your will for my life is, that's what I want. But this is how you follow God. If you are a self-willed person, if you are trying to just use God to point you in the right direction, but then you are going to accomplish everything on your own power and in your own wisdom and in your own might, that's where disasters take place. That's how come people are burned out and ready to quit, is because they have taken the responsibility of all of these things upon themselves. I'm telling you, this is a great key here. It says he took the rod of God. That rod turned into God's rod. When you turn your life over to God and make an absolute surrender to Him and say, God, I'll do anything. I'll go anywhere. I'll do whatever. God gives you back your life, but it's now not your life anymore. It's like Paul said in Galatians 2:20. He says, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. It was not his life anymore, it was God's life. And this is the reason that Paul turned the world right side up. This is why he was able to see people raised from the dead. This is why God used him to write half of the New Testament books, is because Paul had given his life over completely to God. It was completely God's. This is how you follow God. You've got to be yielded unto Him as a yielded vessel. So all of that's true, but there's a flip side to this coin too. And let me just say that Moses in Exodus chapter 4 laid his life down, took it up by the tail, and went down. And because of his yieldedness to God, he did all of these miracles, these 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, and he came out of the land of Egypt. And I mean, it was miraculous. It was supernatural. God brought the mightiest nation on the face of the earth to their knees through a prophet with a stick. But it's because it was God's stick. It was because of what had happened, taking place between God and Moses. But in the 14th chapter, this is after they had come out of the land of Egypt. And in the 14th chapter, it says in verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they turn and encamp between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it shall ye encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So now remember what took place in the 4th chapter. Moses threw his rod down, his life down before God. The Lord told him to take it by the tail. It looked like it was going to kill him, but when he did it, it became the rod of God. And he used that rod and the authority that God had given to him, and he spoke and brought Pharaoh to his knees. Now, here God is telling him, you go camp in this certain place. And the Red Sea was on one side, and then there was mountains on each of the other sides. So in a sense, it was like a box canyon, that there was no way of escape. And God specifically told Moses to encamp in that place, and that God was going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and that Pharaoh would pursue after him. Now think about this. This, in a sense, is Moses putting himself and the entire Jewish nation in the crosshairs of the Pharaoh. I mean, they put themselves in a position, and God said, I am going to use this to draw Pharaoh after you. And to Moses' credit, because he had laid his life down and taken it up by the tail, he was no longer in control. He obeyed God, and he submitted and put himself in a position that was going to guarantee that the Egyptians and all of their military might would come after him. And so that's good. But the Lord went on and told him, and it says that the Egyptians, he's going to be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all of the host, and the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. So in other words, this was the Lord saying that I'm not bringing the Egyptians down here to destroy you, but instead I'm going to be honored. I'm going to glorify myself. I'm going to win over these Egyptians. So Moses did what the Lord told him to do. Sure enough, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Here comes Pharaoh and all of his host after the Israelites. And when the children of Israel saw this happening, they began to panic. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to make themselves a captain and go surrender to Pharaoh, hoping that it would save their lives. And then they turned on Moses and said, this is what we told you when we were in Egypt, that it had been better off for us to stay there as slaves than come out here into the wilderness and be killed by all of the Egyptians. And look at what Moses said unto him. This is in Exodus 14:13. Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. So this shows that Moses once again knew God's will. He knew that God had set this up and was drawing the Egyptians into this place to be honored upon them, as it says up here. And so Moses knew God's will, and he spoke to the people and says, fear not, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord. And then look at the next verse. It says in verse 14, he's continuing to say, the Lord will fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. But then the next verse, verse 15, it says, the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. Now this is amazing to me. So get this picture. Here's the Israelites in this situation where there was no retreat. They were trapped. Here comes the Egyptians down upon them to destroy and kill all of them. The people are in rebellion. Moses calms them by saying, fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. That these Egyptians who you see today, you will see again no more. God's going to fight for you. Great profession of his faith. But then in the next verse, the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Man, when I read that, I thought, God, what do you mean? Why are you crying unto me? Look at all of the Egyptians. We're trapped. They're coming to kill us. And God is saying, why are you crying unto me? Boy, for a while, this really bothered me. And then he says, speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. And then the next verse, but lift thou up thy rod. Let me share with you what the Lord showed me about this. Moses obeyed God. He put himself in a position where God had to come through, and he was believing for God to come through. But after he made this bold profession, apparently he must have gone and fallen on his face before God and started asking for God to intervene and help them. Because God said, why are you crying unto me? He says, speak unto the children of Israel. And so Moses, after he made this bold proclamation, just fell on his face and began to cry out to God for help. And God, in a sense, rebuked him. Why are you crying unto me? Why would he rebuke him? They were in a dire situation. Isn't that the right thing to do? No, because God had given Moses his rod. Moses was no longer doing this on his own. He was doing this at the command of the Lord, and he had the rod of God. He had the authority of God. And God says, you lift up that rod and you part the seas. In other words, God was telling Moses that, Moses, it's time for you to take the authority and the power that I've already given you and use it. And boy, here is something that they look like opposites. And many people can't reconcile these things. But to really flow in the supernatural power of God, you've got to harmonize these two apparent opposites. In Exodus chapter 3 and 4, you see where Moses had been self-willed. He went out and killed an Egyptian thinking he was bringing God's will to pass. But after 40 years in the wilderness, he reached to the place of saying, God, I can't do it. God, it won't work. He had lost this self-confidence. And so God had him throw his rod down, pick it up by the tail, and now he wasn't using his power. He wasn't operating in the flesh, in his own ability. He had the rod of God, and he went out and he used it. But now he was in a situation where he was once again reverting to, oh God, I can't do it. God, here come the Egyptians. God, we're going to be destroyed. And he was calling out to God when the truth was God had already given him his power and authority. And it wasn't time to plead with God for something. He already had what he needed. He needed to use the authority that he already had. Man, I don't know if that ministers to you, but this changed my life. This changed my life. You know, many of you have heard my testimony, but I've been an introvert when I was a kid. I was insecure, couldn't do anything. I had this encounter with the Lord in 1968, and I mean, God just touched me and changed my life. But I constantly am going in between these two things. There's a balance. It's not like you just have an experience with the Lord and then from then on, your life is perfect. But I have these two extremes where I am super confident in the Lord. I can do all things through Christ, and yet I don't believe that I can do anything on my own. I have to be totally void of self-confidence and have Christ confidence. These look like opposites, and yet they are things that need to be in balance. You know, without Christ, I can do nothing. But the truth is, I'm never without Christ. You have to maintain this mindset that, God, I'm nothing without you, and that's true. But, on the other hand, I'm never without Him. And so through Him, I can do all things, Philippians 4:13. These look like opposites, but they actually balance each other. And you never just get the perfect balance and do it perfectly. In my own life, I'll tend towards over here, oh God, I need you. God, I can't do anything without you. And I'll get out of balance. I'll start getting to where I'm emphasizing that too much, and the Lord will remind me that, you know what, you've laid your life down before me. You've taken it up by the tail, and now you've got my power, and you got my authority, and you need to use it. And so I'll start heading back over here and start thinking about the power and the authority that God has given me. And if I'm not careful, I'll get over there to where I don't recognize my dependence on the Lord. I'm so excited about the power and the authority that God's given me and I'll have to come back. And so the truth is, I go towards the things of God kind of like this. And I believe that that's the way that everybody is. This is what was happening to Moses. Moses at one time was so self-confident, he went out and tried to bring deliverance to the Jews through his own power. He failed miserably, and over a 40-year period of time, he came to the point of, God, I can't do it. I can't do it without you. So he had this experience where he threw his rod down, got the rod of God back, and he went down and brought deliverance to the Jews, and he used and exercised his authority. But here, he was in a situation where once again, he was beginning to get over into, oh God, I can't do it. Oh God, we've got to have you do something. And he was forgetting the fact that God had given him his power and authority. This same thing works for you and me. That you know what? God has placed His power on the inside of us. And many people are asking for God to flow and God to solve this situation when the truth is He gave us the power to do it. For instance, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 8, He says, you go heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead. He didn't tell you to pray for the sick to be healed. He told you to go heal the sick. That's implying that you have power. And if you go back to Matthew chapter 10, the first part of that chapter, He gave them power over all sickness and over all demons to cast them out and to cure infirmities. God has given us this power. And so you've got to get to where you recognize that without God, I can do nothing, but I'm not without God. He has given me His power, and in the name of Jesus, I command this sickness to leave. I command this poverty to leave. You've got to do those things. You know, I heard a man, Jack Taylor, preach a message on this in 1973. It was right after Jamie and I got married. And long story, but we had gotten an eviction notice that we were going to be kicked out of our apartment. And anyway, there's reasons for that. It wasn't God's fault. It was my fault because I thought I couldn't work a secular job if I was called to the ministry. And so I just wasn't ministering to very many people, and so I didn't have very much money coming in, and we were being evicted from our apartment. I went and heard Jack Taylor preach. He preached on this exact thing that I'm talking about. And he said, God, if you have surrendered your life to Him, then it's just like when Moses threw that rod down, picked it up by the tail. You now have the rod of God. You now have the power of God, the authority of God. And if you're facing a difficult situation, instead of begging God to intervene, you need to take your authority and speak and command the power of God to manifest. And so Jamie and I went home that night, and I took this message to heart, and we had a little folding chair at a desk, and I laid hands on that folding chair, and I said, God, you gave me authority and power. To the best of my knowledge, I'm doing what you called me to do, and I am not going to be evicted out of this apartment. I said, if you have to turn this chair into money, I just command the finances to come. And at 3 or 3:30 that morning, I had a miracle. Someone woke me up and gave me the exact amount of money that we needed. And I tell you, it's this exact principle. There are some of you that are in dire situations and you're calling out to God, and God is saying to you, just like He did unto Moses, why are you on your face? Get up off your face. Quit crying unto me. Take the authority that I've given you. Now see, you need a balance in this. You need to recognize that without Christ, you're nothing. And so you aren't just sitting there arrogantly commanding everything to come to pass through your own strength and power. You need to recognize that without Christ, I'm nothing. But then on the other hand, you need to recognize that I'm not without Christ, and that God has given me His power and authority, and I have authority, and I am going to say to this mountain, I'm not just going to speak to God about my mountain, but I'm going to speak to this mountain and say, in the name of Jesus, I command you to get out of my life. You command these things that are fighting against you. You got to stand up and take your authority and power. Man, I tell you, this has transformed my life. And I'd like to have a formula that you just push this button and everything works, but it really all depends upon your personal relationship with the Lord. You can get to emphasizing your authority to such a degree that it actually leads you into being self-dependent, thinking that somehow or another it's you and it's your virtue that's doing all of this. And so the antidote to that is you got to recognize that without Christ you're nothing, that it's only through Christ you can do these things. But then you can focus on your inability to such a degree that you forget that you have been given the power and the authority of God. How do you keep these things in balance? The only answer to that I have is you got to maintain a vibrant relationship with God, and God will show you when you start getting too far in one direction.
Spreekt het onderwijs van Andrew Wommack je aan en wil je je hierin verder verdiepen? Dan is Charis Bible College dé plek voor jou. Charis Bible College is de internationale bijbelschool van Andrew Wommack Ministries met vestigingen in verschillende landen, waaronder ook Nederland. Ontdek wie je werkelijk bent en welk plan God heeft met jouw leven. Kies de vorm van onderwijs die het beste bij jou past en begin aan een geweldige reis samen met God bij Charis Bible College.